Whoosh! Hello, BookTube! So every year about this time for the last 2 years, so that would make this my third year running, I have written a blog post on my blog, The Little Decorator, and it is about the 10 books I cannot live without. Now, one year I miscounted and did 11 books I can't live without, but the moral of the story is that you should count your books before you make a blog post. But every year I try to do 10 books that I cannot live without, and the only rules or requirements for this game are that number one, it has to be a book that I've read before, and number two, it has to be a book that I own. So I can't say, oh, I really want to bring the complete works of Shakespeare because I haven't ever read the complete works of Shakespeare. So those are the two requirements. Also, it's 10 books other than the Bible, and I do a mix of fiction and nonfiction, and this year's books were really an odd mix. I had trouble picking them out because when I'm thinking about 10 books I can't live without, I'm thinking about 10 books that I would bring with me to a deserted island or read over and over for the rest of my life or take with me to college. And I didn't read a lot of my own books this year. This year, 2016, I read a ton of library books. I read a ton of borrowed books. I read a ton of books that I hadn't read before, and so I read them and wasn't really into them, and so I gave them away. I also read the entire Harry Potter series, which would be really hard to include in a 10-book list. So I have a few books here, and I wanted to share them with you in video format as well as on the blog. So if you check the link below, you can see my blog and this specific blog post and some more of my thoughts about how I picked the 10. So obviously, The Book Thief. If you've read my 3 favorite books video or watched my 3 favorite books video or any of my videos, you know that The Book Thief's pretty much my number 1 book. And this is just a classic in its own right, and the storytelling is amazing, and the writing is amazing, and I love that it's about a girl who loves books. It's just one of the best books of all time, and if you haven't read it and you're over 13, please pick this up. Another one is Anne of Green Gables. This is just a childhood book. I didn't read it till I was like 10, but I'd seen the movies around that age, and I just read this a lot. I read the entire 6-book series when I was around that 8 to 12 range where I was reading a lot of books, and now that I just have this one and it's really, really pretty, it's not as big of a commitment to jump back into the series. Little Women is about 4 girls, if you don't know the story of Little Women, which you probably should. Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, and they're just, every story in here is just a classic, like, I know the story so well because I've watched the movie and I've read the book multiple times. I got this for Christmas a few years ago, and it's just one that I want to take with me everywhere because it's so pretty. Alright, A Circle of Quiet is a book that I finished last week, and when I closed this book, I said, this is my new favorite book, and this is my new favorite author. Like, that is how good it was. So Madeleine L'Engle is tied up with Jane Austen for my favorite author of all time right now, and I've only read 2 of her books. I've read this, and I read the first Wrinkle in Time book, the Wrinkle in Time book that is part of the Time Quintet. It's a 5-book series, and I'm going to read the rest of that series now that I'm so in love with this author. But not just because she shares my name, but because she shares anecdotes and thoughts on life and writing and the world and God, and tells stories about her small town life, and really is just pursuing, like, it's really kind of sociological. Is that a word? Like, it has societal or sociological? Not psychological. One of those. So it deals with society and analyzes society. And it's just a really good look at a bunch of different things from a bunch of different angles. And she makes so many good points. It was one of those books, and I hate highlighting in books, and I never do it. But it was one of those books that made me want to highlight almost every single word. It was that good. Every single word in here could be quoted, or I should just memorize this book. That's what I should do. I should just memorize this, and then I'll always have it with me, even if I forget it. So that's one of my new favorite books. If you haven't read it, please go read it. I'd say it's PG-13, but 5 out of 5 stars. Just PG-13 for like thematic elements and a little bit of language. Alright, Pride and Prejudice. I wish I could pick every single Jane Austen, but this is the only one I included this year just because I have so many now and it's so hard to pick, but Pride and Prejudice will always be here for me. And it's such a classic. I did get to listen to this one on audiobook this year, and it was cool to see it in a different format. The Giver by Lois Lowry is middle grade, but it's got a lot of YA in it, and I think it's technically YA. This is a 4-part series. This is a quartet. A lot of people just read The Giver because it was a Newbery Medal winner, but it is a 4-book series. When I read this, I read the entire series, and when you see the series as a whole, it makes this book so much better. Like, this is a tiny book. You can't get much in here. There isn't a lot of story or character development, but it's the beginning of a really, really good series. So, as I collect this series, I will hang on to The Giver. I actually have 2 copies of The Giver, so I definitely can't live without it. I can always have one here and one at college, or one here and one on my deserted island, or if the house burns down and I can only grab one, that's okay. Alright, A Tale of Two Cities made this list just because it's a book that, even though I haven't read it recently, it has stayed with me, and the story has shaped me. And I think that if a book is this memorable and you remember this much good feeling around it, then it needs to be a book that you can't live without. So even though I didn't read a lot of these books this particular year, they're books that I'm pretty sure I would want with me to read again. I'm not a big rereader. Another one that I haven't talked about very much here is I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. Dodie Smith wrote 101 Dalmatians, which I've actually never read. I've seen the Disney film. But this is about a writer, and she lives in a castle, and it's a romance, so it's just a romance with a little bit of a twist ending. And I like how she's telling the story, and it's not just that it's in first person, but it's in first person as she's writing it. She's like, I'm curled up in the window seat chronicling today, you know? And so it really gets you into journaling if you're not into journaling, and I highly recommend journaling. Okay, Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg. This is a nonfiction book, just like The Circle of Quiet by Madeline L'Engle. It is about writing, but more than life and writing, A Circle of Quiet is more about life and writing, and I Capture the Castle is kind of a fictional look at writing. This is a bare bones, I guess that's why it's writing down the bones, like methodology and how to get inspiration, and it's very practical, and I find myself going through it putting sticky marks. And I'm like, I want to do this exercise and this exercise and this exercise. And she encourages you to just get a journal and just write everything and anything that you want. Like blend poetry and prose and just get all your thoughts onto the page like every single day. And at the beginning of the journal, you're supposed to write, I have the freedom to write whatever garbage I want, or something like that. So it really just gives you freedom to just take a stab at writing and just go for it, and no one ever has to see anything. She says she has stacks and stacks and stacks of journals she's filled, and I have like 1 stack, so we're getting there. But by the end of my life, I'd love to have stacks and stacks and stacks of journals that I've filled every single page. That would just be amazing. Finally, but last but not least, And Then There Were None is one of my favorite. It is my favorite Agatha Christie of all time. It actually made my top 3 books list. But more than just being one of my favorite books, it's a book that I cannot live without, just because it's nice to have a fun, quirky mystery that's also like kind of dark and scary. And I really enjoyed this one, and if you haven't read it yet, it's probably PG-13 like most of these books, but it's really, really, really worth reading, and it's not too long. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you go read it. So those are the 10 books I can't live without, and obviously the Bible would be on this list. Obviously I would want to take journals with me, but this is just, if the house burned down, if I had to go to a deserted island and live with 10 books for the rest of my life, you know, the books that I could read over and over again, and books that I like the cover, and I like the author, and I like the story. Like, these books have it all, if you know what I mean. So let me know in the comments below, are you a big rereader? What books would you take with you to a deserted island? And don't forget, the book was better.